So this is an attempt at an integral model of complexification of systems through the universe. Because this diagram itself is not all that big, I'm just going to kind of use it as a reference point for myself when I'm trying to express these concepts. So the idea here is that this is a sort of logic that builds on itself, and that each principle acts as the foundation for the next in certain regards, and that in a certain way there's sort of an archaeology of ideas within this map, in that many of these symbols and or diagrams or geometries are concepts that you can find in history. And what I'm trying to do is suggest how these different concepts, diagrams, or geometries connect to each other, and can in some regards potentially predict certain elements of the future in a certain way through and by their integration. In other words, this is paralleled by developmental psychology, and the structures therein suggest a process of evolution that can be mapped. And up to a certain point, there is a level of predictability, but as you go forward, the idea is that there's novelty in the universe, so it's not completely predictable. So starting with number one, in a certain sense, it's undefined space, or absolute suchness. And you might recognize that symbol as an infinity sign. It's two loops connected. And another way to look at that from a different angle is sort of a spiral. And contained in this is nothing. There's no thing. And in that regards, there's absolute potential in it, because there's nothing that has arisen from it. When some object arises, then there's a split. There's a differentiation between absolute space, or emptiness, and object. And with that, you get what might be considered the Tao, or subjective-objective split. And so now you have a fractal relationships of objects that go all the way up and all the way down, and that is emphasized in things like the Tao or the Tao. So the 1 is now 1 plus 1, or 2, where you have empty space plus object. And that's how you get duality. And then when you add 1 plus 2, we get 3. And this is sometimes considered the Trinity. In say, some of the old mythical traditions, they would have, the Son, the Father, and the Holy Ghost, or goodness, truth, and beauty. In essence, the way this would be defined is 1, or the Father, is the great space from which all things can arise, in the sense that there is no thing in it. And then there is the dichotomy, or the duality within that space, where you have a masculine and feminine principle, the feminine being the embrace, or the openness, and then the masculine being the truth. But here we have a progression. We have an element of, going forward in a certain sense, which leads to kinds of power, as I'll try to point out later. 4 is sort of the squaring of 3. 3 is still present, but now we have a balance of the subjective and the objective, whereas in here, you could say potentially the drive towards the eros is not balanced, because it all points to a singular sense, whereas here we have sort of a balancing of the beautiful and the truth with a systemic truth. And so in that regard, there isn't kind of the degree of progression that we see in 3. So here we have the subjective side as the beautiful and the goodness, and then the objective side is truth and systemic truth, which is again an addition of 1, 2, 3, and 4, where the 4 is looking back at the 3 and making an object, or a systemic object that can be analyzed. When form is balanced, then reason is bounded in infinite space, and therefore, when it's balanced, you have a fractal relationship within that space, and it can keep going like forever. There's no stopping of it. And again, that carries with it all of that which went before. So you have, again, an addition of 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 is this squared center of each star in this pictorial system. 6 is essentially this diagram, or we might call it the tetrahedron. Now notice here that I think in each system there's 2 of them. They double itself. So here I just have an expression of the 1, and here it's doubled to give it a better explanation. But you can imagine each of these as doubled. So again, it's like the great space. Number 2 is the Euboris, or the snake eating itself, as some old systems would have. You'd see a snake that kind of eats its own tail, which is suggestive of subject eating its own object. And then you have the Trinity making up the Euboris into a progressionary system. And then you have the Trinity balanced through its center and added up into a star, or the Star of David. And then here we have a 6th system, which I cannot fully understand as to how it would go further from it, but it's balancing of the 5, where the star itself doesn't have a complete balanced structure, where this is more balanced. I won't say too much about it, other than it seems to be about the integration of the system itself in a certain way, or novelty seeing itself. If you look at it through time, it's the expression of how could you objectify time? Well, you would make an object of it, having a clear historical understanding of what has happened historically. So another way of expressing this is absolute subject makes space for objects to arise. Progression creates the trinity or dialectic, which can be squared and balanced in the systemic heart, which can be viewed and analyzed seeing its fractal nature, or the Star of David, which opens up to the entire evolutionary process of time envisioned, or novelty seeing itself. And so in human developmental psychology, there's a certain sense of the first system, even though it really started far before humans, we still have to kind of move through it. And the first one is something to do with survival, the next one emotion, the next one power, the next one order, the next one logic, and the final one vision, where vision is seeing wholes of different structures, different systems. Logic's being able to analyze systems linearly, but this is to do with more like envisioning systems, or systems through logical processes analyzed. And again, there's that progressionary order. You can't have 3 without 2, and you can't have 4 without 3, etc. They all are additionary in that sense. So time's primary focus on Earth would be roughly, 3 billion years ago. You have approximately, the start of Earth, where survival is the primary focus of all sentient beings up into, well, it's kind of exemplified in reptiles 320 million years ago. And then the primary focus seems to switch around 220 million years ago with the arriving of early mammals 220 million years ago, which has the capability or the reality of a limbic system, which allows them to feel emotion. So not only are they just doing fight or flight things, which is the typical theory of evolution, now we have a focus on emotive care for other. So this is 1 plus 1 in a certain regard. We have 2 of the 2, or the we space, I and you, we. And then this is focused on, in a certain regard, up to about, well, you have the evidence of early hominids about 15 million years ago. And you might say that, slowly it's starting to move more into power orientation, but that is not really exemplified till about 15,000 years ago, when you get the strong hierarchical societies where you see pyramids starting to be designed, and slavery is at its peak in a certain regard. And this is refocused, perhaps, in with a sort of wisdom, when you see the early philosophies start to arrive, but this is in a mythological context. Now, even though there might have been some of those 15,000 years ago, it really doesn't become more or less an embodied work until about 6,000 years ago, when you get the early kind of religions starting to arise. But so the focus there starts to be more on wisdom in a certain sense. And then with about another 4,000 years down the road, you start to see more of a focus on compassion. And the Star of David here is that exemplification, where humans are seen as beings worth caring for, in no matter sex, creed, or other focuses as far as what they believe. And then we get integrations of systems approximately now, where we can have enough data and enough understanding of that data where we can envision these super systems that allow us in a certain way to step out of time and envision it objectively. So that allows us to have novelty seeing itself, perhaps.